In 1945, the war in Europe ended. The trials began. The verdicts came. And the world agreed those who had served the Nazi regime would face justice. That was the official story. What the official story did not include was a file that remained classified for over 50 years. A program so sensitive that 3 consecutive American administrations denied its existence. A program that quietly brought former Nazi intelligence officers, men who had worked directly under Heinrich Himmler's SS apparatus, onto the payroll of the United States government. Not 2. Not 10. 600. In 2014, the New York Times published a report based on a secret history commissioned by the CIA itself. Historians Norman Goda and Richard Breitman had been granted access to classified records that most researchers had never seen. What they found inside those files was not a rumor. It was not a theory. It was documented. And it had been denied, officially, repeatedly, for decades. To understand how this happened, you need to understand the situation the United States faced in the summer of 1945. The war against Germany was over. But another confrontation was already beginning to take shape, this one against the Soviet Union. American intelligence planners had a serious problem. They knew almost nothing about Soviet military capability, Soviet troop positions, or Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. The OSS, the wartime predecessor to the CIA, had focused almost entirely on Germany and Japan. The Soviet Union had been an ally. Nobody had been watching them. One man understood this gap better than almost anyone in Washington. His name was Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen had spent the final years of the war as the head of Fremdheerost, Foreign Armies East, the Wehrmacht's military intelligence branch responsible for analyzing the Soviet military. He had built one of the most extensive intelligence networks in Eastern Europe. He had agents, files, and contacts that the United States simply did not have. In May 1945, before Germany's formal surrender, Gehlen made a calculated decision. He microfilmed his entire archive, thousands of pages of intelligence on Soviet capabilities, buried the files in the Austrian Alps, and surrendered directly to American forces. Not as a prisoner. As a businessman offering a transaction. He would give the Americans everything he had built. In exchange, he wanted protection for himself and his former officers, and the right to rebuild his network under American supervision. The Americans accepted. What became known as the Gehlen Organization, later formalized as Operation Rusty, was operational by 1946. Gehlen and his team were relocated to a compound in Pulich, West Germany. Funding came from Washington. The organization was staffed almost entirely by former German military and intelligence officers, many of whom had direct, documented involvement in operations carried out by the Nazi security apparatus. American officials were aware of this from the beginning. A 1952 CIA internal review, later declassified, acknowledged that many Gehlen Organization members had unsavory backgrounds. The review noted that the agency had accepted this as the price of doing business. That phrase, the price of doing business, appears in the actual document. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The justification was straightforward. Soviet intelligence was the priority. Gehlen's network had access and reach that no American-built organization could replicate in the short term. The men with the most useful information about the Soviet Union were, in many cases, the same men who had served the regime that had just been defeated. That tension was never publicly acknowledged. For decades, when journalists or researchers asked about the scale of former Nazi involvement in post-war American intelligence programs, the answer from official sources was either silence or denial. The files told a different story. The document at the center of this story was not supposed to exist publicly. In the early 2000s, the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, passed by the U.S. Congress in 1998, required federal agencies to declassify records related to former Nazis who had worked with or for the American government. The CIA commissioned its own internal history of the Gehlen Organization. That history was written for internal use. It was not written to be published. Historians Norman Goda and Richard Breitman, working as part of the Interagency working group formed under the Disclosure Act, were given access to that internal history and to supporting case files. Their findings were published in 2004 in a report titled U.S. Intelligence and the Nazis. The numbers they documented were significant. Roughly 600 former German intelligence officers had, at various points, worked within or alongside American intelligence programs between 1945 and the mid-1950s. This was not incidental. It was structural. The Gehlen Organization was the primary vehicle, but it was not the only one. Among those who had passed through these programs were individuals with documented connections to the SS, the SD, the Nazi Security Service, and in several cases, to operations that had directly targeted civilian populations in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union during the war. One name that surfaces repeatedly in the declassified files is Heinz Felf. Felf was a former SS officer who joined the Gehlen Organization in the early 1950s and rose to become one of its senior counterintelligence officials. He was trusted. He was effective. He was also, unknown to his American-linked employers for nearly a decade, a Soviet agent. When West German authorities finally identified and arrested Felf in 1961, the damage to Western intelligence networks in Eastern Europe was described by officials as severe. The CIA had vetted him. The vetting had failed. But Felf was not the central concern raised by the declassified documents. The deeper issue was structural. The practice of employing individuals with significant wartime records had been justified, internally, on the grounds of operational necessity. The assumption was that these individuals could be managed, that their usefulness outweighed the risks, and that sufficient oversight existed to contain those risks. The record suggests that oversight was, at best, inconsistent. Some officers were run as direct CIA assets. Others operated at a layer of remove, employed by the Gehlen Organization itself, which gave the CIA a degree of deniability. When the organization was formally transferred to the West German government in 1956 and became the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, West Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, many of the same personnel remained in place. The continuity was deliberate. The concealment was also deliberate. What the files do not answer, what remains genuinely unresolved, is the question of how much the most senior American officials knew about the specific wartime histories of the individuals being employed, and at what point that knowledge became too inconvenient to formally acknowledge. That question was never fully resolved by the internal history. It was not fully resolved by the Interagency working group. It remains open. The official position of the United States government for most of the Cold War was that the scale of former Nazi involvement in American intelligence programs had been minimal, carefully controlled, and a thing of the past. That position was maintained through multiple administrations. It was not accurate. When the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act passed in 1998, it did so over quiet resistance from several agencies, including the CIA and the Defense Department, who argued that declassification would compromise sources, methods, and relationships with foreign intelligence partners, specifically Germany. The resistance was overruled. Over 8 million pages of records were eventually declassified under the Act. What those records showed, in aggregate, was that the earlier denials had been misleading. The scale was not minimal. The oversight had not been rigorous. And the individuals involved had not all been minor figures with limited wartime exposure. Some had not been minor figures at all. The case of Klaus Barbie is the most widely documented. Barbie had served as a Gestapo commander in Lyon, France, during the German occupation, a role that involved the detention, interrogation, and deportation of Jewish families, French resistance members, and others. He was directly responsible for the deportation of Jewish children from a house in the village of Izu in 1944. After the war, American Army Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC, employed Barbie as an informant, paying him and protecting him from French authorities who were actively seeking him for war crimes. When the CIC's exposure became a risk, they facilitated his departure to Bolivia, where he lived under a false identity for decades. He was not extradited to France until 1983. He was convicted in 1987. The U.S. Army formally apologized to France in 1983. The formal apology acknowledged that CIC officers had concealed Barbie's whereabouts from French authorities. It did not address the question of how far up the chain of command the decision had been made, or how many similar arrangements had existed for other individuals who were never identified. What the Goda-Breitman report makes clear is that Barbie was not an isolated case. He was an extreme example within a broader pattern. The pattern was one of institutional prioritization, Soviet intelligence collection above all other concerns, combined with a deliberate avoidance of formal documentation that would have created legal and political liability. The records that were kept in ways designed to limit visibility. Some relevant files were destroyed. Others were never created. This is not speculation. The internal CIA history, as summarized in the Goda-Breitman report, acknowledges the existence of documentation gaps and notes that some gaps appear to be the result of deliberate decisions rather than administrative failure. What that means, practically, is that the full scope of what was done may never be known. Not because the evidence has not been looked for, but because some of it was removed before anyone thought to look. The 600 figure, as significant as it is, may itself be a floor, not a ceiling. Here's what we are left with. A documented program. A scale that was denied for decades. Formal apologies that acknowledged part of what happened, without resolving how decisions were made at the highest levels, or whether the men responsible for those decisions ever faced any consequences at all. The question that the declassified files don't answer, the one worth sitting with, is this. When a government decides that the intelligence value of an individual outweighs accountability for what that individual did, where does that logic end? And who, ultimately gets to make that call? If that question matters to you, leave your answer below. And if you want to keep going deeper into the histories that were never supposed to surface, you know what to do.